My name is Pat Tidwell. I'm a member of the Coweta County History Center here in the library, and a lover of history. I taught in the high school for 40 years, and so this is something that I have a passion about. Okay, we're going to talk to you about what Indian life was like in Coweta County prior to the treaty that took the last land away from them and eventually drove them out of Georgia. The Creek Indians, they did not call themselves that. They were the Muskogee. In their mythology, their chief deity was called the Giver of Breath. And the Giver of Breath brought them from the west, they said, and they crossed a mountain range that was so high they called it the backbone of the world. And I'm assuming that was the Rocky Mountains, but I don't know. They were part of what was known as the 5 civilized tribes: the Choctaw, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Creeks, and Seminoles. And those were the tribes that interacted with the first Europeans when they came, into our state. By 1500, the Creeks had their own alphabet. And but about that same time, they were decimated by disease brought in by the Spanish when Hernando Cortez and his men came through. They brought smallpox and measles, and that decimated the Indian population. And also, there was an internal war about that time. Next, please, ma'am. Before that 1500 cutoff, 1540 cutoff, the Indians who lived here were mound builders. This kind of culture went all the way up into Ohio. You may have seen pictures of the snake that's a big tourist attraction in Ohio. But the chief's house was on top of this mound. This was an artificially created mound. They dug the dirt out and carried it up in baskets to make this mound. And the chief's house would be on the top of this.
Is it a teepee?
No.
We'll get into that.
Oh, cool. And when the chief died, they buried his house and him too, and built the mound up higher and higher. Buried inside of these mounds were beautiful marble statues, and they buried them with things they would need to get to the afterlife: tools and weapons and food and so forth. But after that 1540 cutoff, when there was war and disease, they quit building these mounds. This one is up at Etowah, Cartersville. It's a really neat place to visit if you've never been there. And they've got some of the marble statues that were, buried in these mounds. It's a really interesting thing to do. Okay. Thanks to a man named William Bartram, we know a lot about Creek civilization because he came and lived among the Creeks here in Georgia, and he sketched the plants that they had, the kind of animals that they dealt with. This is one of his drawings of a Creek village. We'll talk more about this in a minute. There was a ceremonial mound where they held important services. Then you had these are called the longhouses. And this is where the tribal council met. And then this is a ball field here. It was actually scooped out so that the tribe members could sit on the side and watch the game. There were 2 different kinds of games that they played. One was called Chucky, and the other one was called stickball. And stickball was known as the little brother of war because it got very, very violent. Then the individual families were organized in tribal clans around the business part of the village. And everybody that lived in this section right here would have been like the clan of the wind or the clan of the bear or whatever it was. And so they were organized in clans around the center of the town. Now, these towns were located up on a bluff above a river. And there was farmland down next to the river. But they knew that the river's flooded, so they built their towns on above. If you've ever been from here to Panama City, you probably went through a town called Eufaula, Alabama.
Oh, yeah.
And there was a Eufaula, Georgia, and then it's all over. Eufaula means bluff city. It was the town was above, on the bluff above, and then their farmland was down next to the river. Okay?
That's cool.
Okay, we got this on bluffs near water, but this was a picture we like because it shows you about their fishing. This is in more than a river. This would be, maybe at the edge of a gulf or something like that. But they would go out in their canoes and they would use their spears. They also had nets that they would, scoop up. And this was something they did in the summertime as a group. They would go down to the edge of the water and they would take their fish and they would dry them so that they would have that food to eat during the winter. Okay? Okay, the kind of homes that they had two different kinds. This one, can you see that there is space between the poles here in this one? Okay, this is the summer house. That usually it was up off the ground. You can see that there's a little bit of space there. But it actually looked more like this. They made it out of cane poles. Have you ever gone fishing with a cane? That they made them out of that, and so that they would have air circulation in the summertime when it was hot. This is a winter house. This one is called wattle and daub. What they did was they put a ring of poles, and then they wove branches between the poles, and then they covered it with mud. And this was, there was a fire in the middle, there was a hearth with a fire, and there was a hole in the top up here, so the smoke would go out. And inside, there was a bench about this high around the whole circle of the house. And that's what people sat on during the day, and it's where they slept at night. And so they'd all have access to the warmth. Okay? All right, this is those long houses that were in the middle. This is where the very important people met on a daily basis, or when they received visitors, who would come in from other towns. And this was the heart of their particular town. And one other thing about the towns were assigned a role, meaning that there were towns that were for war. If you lived in that town, you were an excellent warrior and you defended everybody against attack. There were towns for peace, like if you needed to negotiate, bring somebody in. There were towns that were just for peace. There were towns that were for trade. If you're trading with another people, you come to this town. And the way they designated that was that they used colors. War towns were painted red. Peace towns were painted white. Trade towns were painted blue. And each clan, how we said that the family groups were around, they had a color. And they would paint, like if it was the turtle clan, they would paint their turtle either in red or white or blue, whatever that town was. Okay? This one was in Georgia. This is the wattle, this is the winter house. This is another form of winter house made out of grass. And then when they came in contact with Europeans, then they started building log cabins. These were basically for the upper class Creeks who had gained some wealth and power. And so they lived in log cabins.
Where does that wattle and dot, where does that name come from,
I don't have any
I wonder if
idea.
that's part of the design.
Yeah, that's what it is. The wattle is
You're
the
going in
the
and out.
interlaced branches,
And the
and
dog
then the dog
has
is
a
the
mud.
mud.
That sounds right.
Okay. Creeks were originally hunters and gatherers, but they learned to farm. But this is an example. They subsisted on what were known as the Three Sisters. corn, beans, and squash. They planted them all in one mound. They mound up the dirt, and then in the middle they plant corn, and then around that would be the beans, and around that would be the squash. And the corn would grow up. It would be the stalk for the beans to climb up. And then the squash would spread out and protect the ground, cover the ground between the mounds so that it didn't lose moisture and that kind of thing. I thought that was pretty ingenious. They had all kinds of dry beans, several kinds of squash. Their most popular thing was a pumpkin. They grew these in their little, next to each one houses. They had a little garden patch. And the women were in charge of the farming. And they loved this because it was sweet. But they would cut it this way in rounds, and they would hang them up in a smokehouse and dry them so that they would have the sweet all year long. Okay, let's see, what else? Go ahead. Gourds were a popular thing. I don't think they ate gourds. I know that what would have happened with this is it would have been allowed to dry, and then they would have cleaned it out and used it as a dipper, to get water or something like that. And then they also used gourds to store their corn because that was the most important thing. You've all seen Indian corn. And they did have this, but they also had a white corn. And corn was the mainstay of their diet. And it came, they came in 2 crops a year. And the first corn that came, they ate, because they were so happy to have it. But then they planted another crop, and this is what they made, hominy. We ate hominy growing up. They would crack it and boil it, and that's how you made the hominy. And the second crop of corn, they had a festival. It's late July or early August when that second crop of corn came in. It was a big thing. Everybody came, all your relatives, everybody got there. It was called Bask, B-A-S-K. And it actually was a longer word than that, but that's all I can remember. But it was a special ceremony because it was renewal. They forgave everybody of all their trespasses at that festival. The only thing they would not forgive was murder. But anything that somebody had done to you, if they came to that festival, then you forgave them and you started all over again. I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
You might as well go ahead and talk about it. Of course, they grew the corn and the beans and squash, but they also knew where they could find blackberries and blueberries and skeletons. And we call these bulluses. That's what when I was growing up.
What?
Bulluses.
What?
The purple muscadines.
Oh, those are muscadines.
Yes, what she said.
But we called them bulluses to separate them from the scuppernans.
Oh.
That's in South Alabama. That's what we call them.
Okay. We just call them muscadines and scufflingines.
They knew where they could find all of those, and they also knew where they could find apples, pears, and peaches. And in the summertime, when these got ripe, they would move their whole village. They would go to wherever they could find these, and they knew the specific places to go. And that's when they would set up those temporary houses made out of the river canes, so that they could have a home while they gathered and preserved all these things. And let's see what else. One of the mainstays of their diet was a sweet potato. Sweet potatoes have been around for a long time. And what we found out, archaeologists and anthropologists have studied and found that Southeast American Indians were healthier than all the other Indians that were in the United States, what is the United States today, because of their plant-based diet. Now, they supplemented it with meat, deer and turkey and turtles and all kinds of things. But the fact that they had these plants that gave them the nutrition that other places didn't get. Because the Plains Indians, all they had was buffalo. And that's really not a very healthy diet. One of their favorite things, I think it's the next one. Oh wait, I had to talk about this one. This is sassafras root. This was common here in our area, and the women would gather it, and they made root beer. That was a favorite drink. But they sold it. The Europeans wanted it. Whole shitloads of sassafras were shipped to Europe, and it became a big trade item for the women who were doing the farming. And now, you and I have seen this all our lives if you're from the South. This is poke salad or poke berries. I was told never ever to touch one of these because they were poison. And what the Indians knew how to do, though, was they cooked the berries and the leaves and even the roots. The roots were supposed to be very poisonous. But they knew that if you boiled it, took that water off, boiled it again, took that water off, at least 3 times, you threw away the water, and then you could eat it. And it was a mainstay in their life. I don't know that I would want to eat it, but I do know people who have eaten poke salad.
I just saw poke salad.
Yeah,
I had a cousin that would cook poke salad.
yeah, yeah.
I wouldn't eat it.
Let's
You got
see.
nuts and
Let me see. Oh yeah, hickory nuts. The South at the time of these Indians was covered in hickory trees, hardwood hickory trees. These are the nuts. They are extremely difficult to crack and get the meat out of. So the Indians didn't worry about that. They would take their hammers, something that looked like this. It would have had a handle that came down this way, and they would crack them, just hit them and crack them. And then they boiled them, and they would sift, get the shells out and keep boiling it, and, sift it again. And they used the meat to make flour for breads and cakes, and then, but the most prized part of it was an oil that came to the surface when they were boiling. They would skim it off and put it in containers, and they sold that too. It was highly prized for putting in their baking. The only other grease that they used was bear grease. That too was very prized. And this, of course, is tobacco. The tobacco grown by the women of the tribe was in their little garden patch outside their house. But it was bitter. They only reserved it for ceremonial things. They smoked, at big, like that bash ceremony in the fall, when they were forgiving everybody for their sins. They would smoke pipes of this, and their pipes were usually made out of stone. They carved them out, put a stem on them. It was not until the Europeans arrived. Now, they liked the idea of this, but it was too bitter. It was John Rolfe, who was at one time the governor of Virginia, who imported the first tobacco from Trinidad, one of the Caribbean islands. And it had a very pleasant taste, very mild. But the Indians still left the abuse of the tobacco to the Europeans. So they basically reserved the smoking of tobacco for the Europeans. Okay? Okay, we said that meat supplemented their diet. Deer, turkey, fish, carrier pigeons. Now, the Native Americans did not wipe out the carrier pigeons. That was the Europeans when they arrived. At one time, there were millions of carrier pigeons, and Europeans shot them with their guns and hunted them, and to extinction. They don't exist any longer. And the fish, mussels. They loved mussels, and I'm going to call them what we call them in South Alabama, crawfish. They love that, to get out of fresh water streams. And then turtles. They made soup with turtles. But that was basically the meat they used to supplement their plant diet. Okay? I love this. If you've ever been up to Blue Ridge, take the train, go up to, Copper Hill?
Yeah.
Copper Hill. And as you're going along the Toccoa River, if you're going toward Copper Hill, it'll be on your right. You can look out and see these in the river. This is a fish trap. They took stones and made these V's in the river that made the fish, funnel into, and then they would go down here with their nets and catch them. They also, sometimes, when the fish were running in the river, they would take herbs, I don't know what kind, maybe a little poke salad berry, I'm not sure, but they would take herbs and put it in the water, and the fish would float to the top and they'd kill them. Okay?
Okay.
They were
It's
ingenious.
interesting.
Okay, this is dress for a typical man and woman of the Creek Nation before the arrival of Europeans. The men wore a breechcloth, a loincloth, but then they also wore leggings made out of deer skin. Now, this is a chief. He's wearing a blanket. I don't think it was cold because men did not wear shirts until it was cold weather. And then the shirts came down sometimes to the knees, to protect them from the cold. Creek men did not have much facial hair. So what they did was they took some of those mussel shells and used them like tweezers and plucked the hair on their faces. So they were clean shaven. And also they would take those and they would pluck the hair on the sides of their heads, so they wound up with what looks like a mohawk. All right, the ladies wore wraparound skirts, and then they had a shawl that they put over the head, almost like a Mexican serape or whatever, had a place for your head to come out of. Now this lady would have been a very important lady in her tribe because this is so highly decorated with shells and
She looks so
fringe.
young, too.
I'm sorry.
She looks so young.
Yes, definitely. She would probably been a G-star, or maybe a wife. Clan membership was traced along the matrilineal line. If your mom was in the Wynn clan, then you were born into the Wynn clan, whichever. And you did not marry within your own clan. That was why you went to big ceremonies at different places so that you could meet somebody else for marriage. When there was a marriage, the gentleman moved in with the wife and her family. It was a trial, there was a trial period for marriage. He had to build his wife a house and prove that he could support her before the marriage became, final. And if either one of them walked away during that trial period, no foul. No harm, no foul.
That's interesting.
I thought so too. Okay, they like to play games. And this one was played before the Europeans arrived. And then when the Europeans arrived, they changed to another one that was a little more lethal. Okay, this is called chunky. You see there's a disc here. It's kind of like a hockey disc, maybe a little bit bigger. And you had, this is the field. Remember I said it was dug out so that people would sit on the sides? Okay, you had one person who would take this disc and roll it down this field. And then there were contestants along who would throw a long pole or a spear And the object of the game was to get as close to that puck as you could. The closest one, it's kind of like horseshoes, maybe. And whoever got the closest was the winner. And that was just, that was just a fun game. Okay? But then we had stickball. When the Europeans showed up, things changed. Stickball, I've seen it referred to as a cross between lacrosse, hockey, and football. There could be hundreds of players in this game. And sometimes the field was, 300 or 400 yards long. And they would run back and forth. They would have two sticks. Now, there was a version of lacrosse played by Native Americans further north. They had one stick. Our guys had two. And there was a little net in each one, and you had a ball. The ball was made out of leather strips wrapped around usually a rock or something hard on the inside. And as you threw that thing back and forth across the road, see what happened? That thing, if it hit you, was going to knock you out. People died playing this
Oh
game.
my gosh.
And sometimes it would go on for days. But they used it, not all the time, but in some instances, they used it to instead of war. They would have two sides who would come in that were having a dispute, and whichever side won the game, then they won the dispute, whatever it was. So it started as a little brother war. Do you want me again? No, I'm just getting it out there so I'll see it. Okay, next one. Oh, wait, no, go ahead. You can go back. Okay, this is a perfect example of the dress. He's got on his loincloth. He's got on his loincloth, no shirt. The hair would have been down. Men generally wore their hair up in a knot on the top of their head, and they would put a feather, or maybe two. Creek Indians did not wear war bonnets. They didn't wear those things with no feathers like Plains Indians did. But ordinarily his hair would have been up in a knot on top of his head. But of course, during this and playing this game, that went by the wayside. Okay? Okay, burials. And we've already talked about how during the earliest period, they buried them in mounds. But how each individual person was buried, they dug a 4-foot square hole, and they buried the person in a seated position. And there were, in some instances, you could build a house over where you had put the person was buried. But in many instances, that 4-foot square hole was dug underneath where the person had slept in the house. And, where their bed was over it, so that the spirit remained with them. Now, these are two of the marble statues that were carved, and they found them inside one of the mounds at Etowah. And they were painted bright colors.
And that's the way they would be sitting in a grave.
In a grave.
Yeah. The men would sit Indian style, and the women would squat on their knees.
Interesting.
And I never knew about the burial houses till I read this.
I didn't either.
Where was that, I wonder?
I don't know.
A lot of those are in Oklahoma, so it may have been after. You see a lot of them in Oklahoma, so it's probably after the
That
removal.
looks like it's in the churchyard, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It does.
Looks like a mausoleum.
In my home church in Alabama, we had several of these. I always thought it was just somebody protecting the grave, never even thought about it.
And that is the reason the Indians did that, was to protect the grave from animals digging up, because it was just a 4x4.
Yeah.
And animals would dig up the remains, so they would build a house over the top of it.
Okay.
That's cool.
Okay, this map shows the Creek world after Europeans came in. This is a road. It went from Mobile, Alabama, up into North Georgia. You see it broken. Eventually, it will go all the way up into Virginia and all the way down to New Orleans. But it was used for delivering the mail. It was, for the Pony Express. And those are jobs that Creek Indians took. They rode for the postal delivery. They were guides. Sometimes Creek women were hired as prostitutes for travelers. They had temporary jobs sometimes. But the thing that's important about this, that Oglethorpe arrived here in 1733, the first Europeans. So Georgia was this little area right here at the time even of the American Revolution. And as soon as the Creeks did a bad thing, they supported the British in the American Revolution because as Europeans began to come in, you had the Spanish down here in Florida. You had the French over here. And of course, then the British here. The Creeks preferred to trade with the British because their prices were better and their products were of better quality than the Spanish and the French. And so the British used that trade, as a power, and they convinced the Creeks to fight against the Spanish and the French, to help protect the British. And they fought them in several wars that way. And because they supported the English in the Revolution, that is going to cost them their land. In 1805, the first treaty that took away part of their land.
1790. The New York Treaty. Washington did the New York Treaty.
Yeah, that's true. 1790, George Washington did sign the treaty, but it really wasn't enforced at that point. And in 1805, there was another one, and it took away from the Oconee River to the Oklahoma River. They were forced to give up that one. And then over the period of time, you can see more and more cessions. This part in 1814, and this over here in Alabama, let's see, what was next? 21, 26, and then this is the one that finally drove them out because the government had made, in the 1790 treaty, the government had made a deal with Georgia. They said, Georgia at that time stretched all the way to the Mississippi River. What is today Alabama and Mississippi was part of Georgia. So the state of Georgia agreed, they signed the treaty, saying that they would give up all that claim to that western land. In return, they got a very large sum of money. And the other part of it was that all the Indians would be removed from the state of Georgia. Now, it didn't all come at one time because they didn't war, they negotiated it little by little by little. But the Indians will eventually lose all their land. And after the death of Chief McIntosh in 1825, when he gave up the land that is today Coweta County, he was murdered in his home over at Whitesburg. And the upper creeks, the lower creeks, I didn't make that claim up. There were lower creeks, those were the creeks in Georgia, between the Chattahoochee River and the Oklahoma. And then there were the upper creeks. They were along the Tallapoosa River and down to the Tallapoosa, the Black Warrior, down the Alabama River. And they wanted to maintain their independence. They didn't want to cede any land. They wanted to stay their primitive way. McIntosh was one of those people who saw the handwriting on the wall. He knew that Europeans, at the time that he was murdered, there were about 22,000 creeks in the state of Georgia. There were 83,000 Europeans. And so he being Scottish and dealing with, the half Scottish and dealing with the Europeans, he saw the handwriting on the wall and knew that the Europeans were not going away, that they were only going to keep coming. And so he made a deal, to sell the land in Georgia, and the government was going to pay them a large sum of money and give them land over in what is today Oklahoma, the Indian Territories. And they would build them blacksmith shops, and they had all kinds of things in the tree. And he had agreed to it, and he tried to talk the other creeks into it. The lower creeks will finally agree, and they will move before this day right here. The lower creeks had moved to Oklahoma. The upper creeks will be defeated in the war with Andy Jackson, and they will be left with nothing. So that's the way it happened. Okay? And the reason we put this one in is we wanted you to see. This is the first reference we found to Coweta. Now there was a town called Coweta, but it was on the Chattahoochee River down near Columbus. But this is us, right there. We thought that was pretty cool. 1732. And that's it. Question.
No, it was me, Ben Hawkins.
You have heard the expression, or have you ever heard the expression, if the good Lord's willing and the creeks don't rise?
Yeah.
He was not talking about water.
Oh,
It was the Creek Indians.
that's
And
fine.
Ben Hawkins was the Indian agent who said that. What,
1813
Somewhere
or somewhere
along there.
along there. He died 1816, so
Yeah.
it's somewhere around
So
1813.
I was at a breakfast yesterday with retired teachers, and somebody used that phrase, and I went, let me tell you about that.